Alright, get ready for this because it's one wild ride. This is the most ridiculous, frustrating, and ultimately satisfying experience I've ever gone through. I'm sharing this because I need to let it out, but honestly, the way it all ended was so sweet that I just have to tell you about it. My name is Imani Johnson, and I live in a fairly nice, but super generic suburban neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. I've been here for 5 years now, ever since I got a promotion at my tech company. Honestly, I love my place. It's got a pretty good-sized yard, it's close to work, and best of all, there's a beautiful in-ground pool in my backyard. That pool is my sanctuary, my escape, the place I go to relax after a long day of dealing with code and office drama. I've worked hard for everything I have, and that pool represents all that effort. Things started to go sideways last Saturday. The sun was out, the birds were singing, and I thought it was the perfect day for a swim by myself. I slipped into my favorite floral swimsuit, grabbed a cold glass of lemonade, and headed outside. I spent a couple of hours just floating around, listening to music, and enjoying the sunshine. As the sun started to set and the air began to cool, I decided it was time to wrap up. I did one last lap, climbed out of the pool, and started the process of covering it up. Now, covering the pool is kind of a routine. It involves unrolling the big solar cover, lining it up just right, and then securing it with these water-filled tubes. It's not super complicated, but it does take some time and focus. I was about halfway through when I noticed someone staring at me. Standing right at the edge of my yard, separated by only a low decorative fence, was a woman. She looked to be in her late 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and that constantly disapproving look that you often see in certain suburban types. I recognized her immediately. It was Deborah Miller, the president of the HOA and the self-appointed sheriff of all things Willow Creek Estates. I gave her a polite nod and a small wave, hoping she'd get the hint that I was busy. "Afternoon, Deborah," I called out, hoping she'd just wave and move on. No such luck. She stayed right there, glaring at me, her lips tight, eyes narrowed. A bad feeling started to settle in. I knew this was going to be one of those interactions. "Imani, isn't it?" she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness that didn't hide her disapproval at all. "Yes, Deborah. Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. All I wanted was to finish covering my pool and get inside. "Well," she dragged out the word like she was enjoying the suspense. "I was just wondering why you're closing the pool so early." "It's barely evening," I replied, holding back a sigh. "Here we go. I'm done swimming for the day, and I like to cover it up to keep the leaves and debris out," I explained, trying to keep my tone calm. "It helps keep the water cleaner and retains heat." Deborah's eyes roamed across my yard, lingering on the well-kept lawn and the vibrant flower beds. I knew exactly what she was doing, looking for something, anything, to complain about. "I just think it's a shame to cover it up when there's still so much daylight left," she finally said, landing on a gripe. "It's such a beautiful pool. It really adds to the neighborhood's look." I rolled my eyes on the inside. The neighborhood's look. Of course. That woman was obsessed with property values. "I appreciate that, Deborah, but it's my pool, and I'm choosing to cover it," I replied, finally letting some edge creep into my voice. "I'm sure you understand." Of course, she didn't. Her face tightened even more, and I could almost see the wheels turning as she tried to find a way to keep this going and flex her perceived power. "Well, I just hope you're not planning on keeping it covered all the time," she said, her tone carrying a subtle warning. "The HOA has rules about maintaining appearances, you know." And right then, I knew it wasn't over. This wasn't really about the pool cover. There was something else going on here. I finished covering the pool, ignoring Deborah standing there, and went inside, my mood completely ruined. I tried to shake it off, but her words kept echoing in my mind. Maintaining appearances. That phrase felt so loaded, especially coming from her. I've dealt with enough microaggressions in my life to recognize the faint, but unmistakable, hint of racism in her words. It wasn't about the pool. It was about me, about my place in a neighborhood where, let's face it, I didn't quite fit the typical picture. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner, turning up the music, and focusing on something other than that passive-aggressive encounter. But the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that Deborah wasn't going to drop it. And unfortunately, I was right. About an hour later, as I was settling onto the couch to watch a movie, I heard a knock at the door. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't home, but I knew ignoring it wouldn't make the problem disappear. Whoever was at the door would just keep knocking, or worse, make things escalate. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and opened the door. Standing there, with 2 police officers beside her, was Deborah Miller. My heart dropped. "Good evening, Imani," she said, that same sickly sweet tone, but this time, there was a gleam of triumph in her eyes. "I'm afraid we have a bit of a situation here." I glanced past her at the officers, trying to read their faces. They looked awkward, almost embarrassed. "Ma'am, we got a call about a disturbance," one of the officers said, his tone apologetic. "Ms. Miller here reported some possible suspicious activity." I turned my attention back to Deborah, my anger bubbling under the surface. "Suspicious activity? What are you talking about?" I asked, barely keeping my voice calm. "Well," Deborah said, acting all innocent, "I was just concerned. Imani has been covering her pool for hours now, and I haven't seen her, or anyone else, go outside. It's just unusual, and honestly, a little concerning." I couldn't believe my ears. She had called the cops because I covered my pool and stayed inside my house. The nerve of her was unbelievable. "Deborah, are you serious?" I said, my voice rising in shock. "You called the cops because I covered my pool? I live here. This is my house." The officers shifted uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we understand your frustration, but we have to follow up on all reports," he said. "We just need to ask you a few questions to make sure everything is okay." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. Getting angry wasn't going to help. I needed to stay calm and lay out the facts clearly. "Of course, officer," I said, turning to face them. "There's nothing suspicious going on. I covered my pool because I was done swimming. I came inside to relax and watch a movie. That's it. That's the extent of the suspicious activity." The officers nodded, their expressions softening. They clearly realized how ridiculous the situation was. "We appreciate your cooperation, ma'am," one of them said. "We just need to confirm a few things." Then, to my surprise, one of the officers turned to Deborah. "Ms. Miller, do you have any evidence to support your claim of suspicious activity?" Deborah stammered, her face turning red. "Well, no, not exactly," she said. "It's just a feeling I had." The officer raised an eyebrow. "A feeling," he repeated. "That's it." The other officer stepped forward. "Ms. Miller, we understand your concern for the neighborhood, but calling 911 based on a feeling isn't appropriate," he said, his tone serious. "It wastes valuable resources and can potentially put people in danger. We need reasonable suspicion of a crime before we can investigate." I watched Deborah's face twist in a mix of anger and embarrassment. She hadn't expected the officers to push back. She thought she could use them to harass me and intimidate me, but it had completely backfired. After a few more questions aimed at de-escalating the situation and ensuring I was okay, the officers turned their focus back to Deborah. The lead officer, a tall, imposing man named Officer Reynolds, asked her why she felt the need to call 911 with so little evidence. Deborah sputtered and stammered, trying to defend herself, but the officers weren't buying it. Then, Officer Reynolds said something that completely caught me off guard. "Ms. Miller, while we're here, we need to run a routine background check on all parties involved," he said flatly. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I had nothing to hide. I'm a law-abiding citizen with a clean record. But the idea of having my background checked, of my entire life being examined because of Deborah's baseless accusations, felt incredibly invasive. But then I looked at Deborah. Her face had drained of color, and her hands were shaking. She opened her mouth to protest, but Officer Reynolds interrupted her. "It's standard procedure, ma'am," he said, his tone final. "We just need to verify your identity and make sure there are no outstanding warrants or anything like that." The officers took down our details and walked back to their patrol car to run the check. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Deborah stood there, fidgeting, her eyes darting around nervously. I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She had tried to use the police to intimidate me, and now she was the one under investigation. While we waited, the other officer, a younger woman named Officer Jones, struck up a conversation with me. She was incredibly apologetic about the situation and made it clear they didn't condone Deborah's actions. She even admitted that they got an unusually high number of calls from this neighborhood, mostly involving petty complaints and disputes. Then, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Ms. Johnson, Are you familiar with the HOA regulations regarding pool maintenance? I frowned. Yes, I've read them, I replied. I'm pretty sure I'm in compliance with everything. Officer Jones paused for a moment before continuing. Just out of curiosity, do you remember anything specific about pool cover regulations or any clauses that might mention how often the pool should be used? I thought for a second, trying to recall. I remembered going through the HOA documents when I first moved in, but it had been some time. I don't remember anything specific, I said, but I can check again. Officer Jones nodded. It might be worth a look, she said. Sometimes, these HOA rules can be unclear. The officers returned from their patrol car a few minutes later. Officer Reynolds walked over to Deborah, his face serious. Ms. Miller, he said, his voice low. We need to step aside for a moment. He led her away from the door, towards the edge of my yard, and they began talking in whispers. I couldn't hear them, but I could see Deborah's face becoming more and more agitated. She was gesturing wildly, her voice rising. Whatever they had found, it wasn't good. Officer Jones stayed by the door, watching the scene unfold. She looked at me with a look that said she knew exactly what was going on. Ms. Johnson, she said quietly, I think you might want to take a look at Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph B of the HOA regulations. Specifically, the section about abuse of authority and misuse of community resources. I stared at her, confused. What was she hinting at? What had the background check revealed about Deborah? And how did it tie into the HOA rules? Things were starting to come together, but I couldn't quite figure out the full picture. Officer Reynolds came back, his expression unreadable. He addressed Deborah firmly but calmly. Ms. Miller, we're going to have to ask you to come down to the station with us to answer a few more questions, he said. Deborah's eyes widened in shock. What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong, she protested, her voice high-pitched. We believe you may have misused community resources and abused your position as HOA president. Officer Reynolds replied. We need to investigate further. I stood there in stunned silence as the officers placed Deborah in handcuffs and led her away. The feeling of triumph I'd had was quickly replaced by disbelief. What had she done? Officer Jones, who had stayed behind, turned to me with a sympathetic look. Ms. Johnson, I know this has been a tough situation, she said, but I think you'll find things are about to get a lot better. She explained that the background check had uncovered a pattern of complaints against Deborah for abusing her role as HOA president. Apparently, she had a history of harassing residents, selectively enforcing rules, and even using community funds for personal expenses. The 911 call had been the tipping point. Calling the police over a baseless suspicion was a clear misuse of authority and a waste of taxpayer resources. It also revealed Deborah's other wrongdoings, exposing a pattern of shady actions and unethical behavior. After the police left, I went inside and immediately opened the HOA regulations online. I found Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph B, just as Officer Jones had recommended. The language was heavy and legal, but the meaning was straightforward. Any HOA member who misuses their power, abuses community resources, or engages in harassment or discrimination is subject to disciplinary action, including removal from their position. Over the next few days, I gathered evidence to back up my claims against Deborah. I spoke to other neighbors who had been harassed by her as well. I collected emails, letters, and documented examples of her discriminatory behavior. It turned out I wasn't alone. Many residents, especially those from minority groups, had faced unfair treatment and selective enforcement of HOA rules. We all came together and decided to demand Deborah's removal as HOA president. A week later, the HOA scheduled a special meeting to discuss the allegations against Deborah Miller. The room was packed with residents, many eager to share their stories. The tension was palpable, but there was also a sense of hope and resolve. I presented my evidence along with testimonies from other residents. We outlined Deborah's history of harassment, misuse of funds, and discriminatory actions. Deborah, who was present at the meeting, vehemently denied the accusations. She claimed she was being unfairly targeted and that everything she did was for the good of the community. But her arguments didn't hold up. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the residents' testimonies were compelling. After hours of debate, the HOA board voted overwhelmingly to remove Deborah Miller as president. She was also barred from any future leadership roles in the HOA. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Justice had been served. Deborah's removal as HOA president marked a turning point for Willow Creek Estate. It was the beginning of change, a rejection of the discriminatory practices that had taken root for so long. In the months that followed, the HOA was completely revamped. New leaders were elected, and new policies were put in place to ensure fairness and transparency. The new board made an effort to reach out to the residents who had been marginalized under Deborah's leadership. They actively sought feedback from diverse groups and worked to create a more inclusive and welcoming community. They organized events that celebrated diversity and promoted understanding. They also revised the HOA regulations to eliminate any ambiguity or room for discriminatory enforcement. One of the first changes was to clarify the pool cover rules, ensuring residents could cover their pools whenever they wanted without fear of harassment. A fair system for resolving disputes was also put in place, guaranteeing that everyone was treated with respect and dignity. The atmosphere in Willow Creek Estates began to shift. Neighbors started talking to each other, getting to know one another, and building real relationships. The suspicion and distrust that had pervaded the community under Deborah's rule slowly faded away. People started feeling more comfortable expressing themselves, sharing their cultures, and embracing their differences. Personally, I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I no longer felt watched or judged. I could relax and enjoy my home without the fear of harassment or discrimination. I even began to feel a sense of pride in my community, knowing we had come together to create a better place for everyone. I also made new friends. I connected with other residents who had been targeted by Deborah, and we formed a support group to share our experiences and offer encouragement. We organized community events, volunteered for local causes, and worked together to push for positive change. We became a force for good, showing that diversity and inclusion were strengths, not weaknesses. As bad as the situation with Deborah was, it ultimately brought the community closer. It forced us to confront our biases, challenge our assumptions, and work toward a more just and equitable society. It taught us the importance of standing up for what's right, speaking out against injustice, and holding those in power accountable for their actions. The legal consequences for Deborah didn't end with her removal from the HOA. The police investigation into her misuse of community funds uncovered significant evidence of fraud and embezzlement. She was eventually charged with multiple felonies, including theft, fraud, and abuse of power. I attended the trial, along with several other residents who had been affected by her actions. We testified about the harassment, discrimination, and financial wrongdoing we had witnessed. The prosecution made a compelling case, and the jury found Deborah guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to several years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and the residents she had harmed. It was a satisfying conclusion to a long, difficult battle. While no amount of punishment could undo the damage she caused, it sent a clear message that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. But the real victory wasn't just Deborah's punishment. It was the transformation of Willow Creek Estates into a more inclusive and just community. It was about empowering the residents who had felt silenced and marginalized. It was about creating a space where everyone felt valued, respected, and safe. A few months after Deborah's trial, I decided to take a swim in my pool. The water was crystal clear, the sun was shining, and the birds were singing. As I floated on my back, staring up at the sky, I couldn't help but smile. I thought about everything that had happened, the struggles we had faced, and the progress we had made. I thought about Deborah Miller, now in prison, and I felt a sense of closure. But more importantly, I thought about my neighbors, the friends I had made, and the vibrant community we had built together. I realized that Deborah's actions had ultimately backfired. She tried to divide us, intimidate us, and silence us. But instead, she brought us closer, strengthened our resolve, and inspired us to create a better world. As I got out of the pool, I noticed a group of kids playing in the park across the street. They were laughing, running, and chasing each other, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded in our neighborhood. They were just kids, enjoying the sunshine and the simple pleasures of life. I knew that, because of the changes we had made, they would grow up in a community that was more accepting and tolerant. A place where everyone was welcome, no matter their race, ethnicity, or background. That, I realized, was the sweetest justice of all. Not just Deborah's punishment, but the creation of a community where everyone had the chance to thrive. And as I walked back into my house, dripping wet but filled with peace and contentment. I knew I had finally found my place in Willow Creek Estate, not just as a homeowner, but as a member of a community truly committed to justice, equality, and inclusion. And that, more than anything, made me feel like I was finally home.